have a deep resentment towards Jimmy Fallon because one time he had Keith Richards on, maybe 10 years ago when they reissued Exile on Main Street, right? Jimmy Fallon asked Keith Richards, what's your favorite Rolling Stones record? And he said, Between the Buttons. And I went, oh! I actually yelled. And I went, oh my God, he's going to talk about Between the Buttons. And then Jimmy Fallon said, yeah, but Exile on Main Street's really great too, isn't it? And then they just talked about Exile on Main Street, which is a great record. But he's on a tour talking to everybody about Exile on Main Street. I don't think I've ever heard an in-depth interview with Keith Richards about Between the Buttons. And I'm like, I want to hear that interview. I want to seek out Keith Richards and talk to him about Between the Buttons, because at some point he's not going to have any opinion about it, or he's not going to remember or anything about it. But it was just like, oh my God. So every time I see Jimmy Fallon, I'm just like, ugh.
My guess is that Fallon had no idea what he was talking about.
Exactly. Had the list.
What's that? Between the Buttons? I don't know what you're talking about. He couldn't have told you one song on there, I'm sure. That's why he didn't talk about it.
Exactly.
But you're right. That would have been fascinating, especially since he opened that door. Okay, let's go there.
Yeah, exactly. You'd think a comedian, right? Yes, and, right? You don't put a wall up, you follow, right? But I guess that's not. Yeah, he needs to do the interview.
The Maron interview with Keith Richards, Maron had quit, he's sober and hasn't smoked in forever. And Keith Richards is like, can I smoke in here? And Maron normally says no to everybody. He's like, of course. And he's like, do you want one? And Maron was like, yes. So he's like, I'm not going to not smoke a cigarette with Keith Richards, because he's a huge fan of the Stones. And so it's like,
that sits with me too. I remember hearing that and going, wow, Mark Maron talks constantly about how he hasn't smoked for 10 or 15 years. And within 15 minutes, Keith Richards has completely corrupted him and had him go back to his old habits. And that to me felt a little weird. It's like, if you have that power, is that what you're supposed to be using it for? It's like, oh, go ahead. Start smoking again. Hang out with me, and it feels like, ooh,
yeah, but he gave Maron that experience, though. I know. I swore I would never smoke another cigarette on my marriage. I don't know. If Keith Richards offered me a cigarette, I might smoke it with him.
Then in my mind is, well, what other situations in Keith Richards' life has he done that same kind of thing?
All the time. I can tell you for a fact that I've interviewed him before, and he wants you to come into his inner sanctum and, party with me. It's like, there's always a fifth sitting around, and he's always wants to share it. Sometimes he'll offer you a glass, sometimes not. And, the cigarettes and any other chemical is probably readily within reach. And he likes having a buddy, and it doesn't matter who it is. You just happen to be the guy that's available right now, and all the other Stones are extremely different, but he's like a different character altogether. There's no armor up at all with that guy. It's just like, he just lets you in, and if you piss him off, he'll probably punch you or stab you or something. But it's like, as long as you're getting along, he's a barrel of laughs. He's a funny guy, and he's also very affable. Which I can't say about, Mick or any of the other guys.
They've got a wall up.
Sort of with the theme of what we're talking about, Greg, isn't that awesome? Isn't that what you want from when you talk to an artist, is to have that kind of a conversation with them? Or?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few are like that. Who's surprisingly accessible or surprisingly just a real gent, a real good guy, is Iggy Pop. He's just a genuinely friendly person, really smart. Like he said, critics thought we had like a 300-word vocabulary after the first Stooges album. They thought they were literally like primitive ape men. They were stupid and could barely string a sentence together. And then you talk to this guy and you realize he's, extremely well-read and really smart and very nice. And, it's part of it, I think, is that Midwestern upbringing. I mean, when you grow up in a trailer outside of Detroit, you are around a lot of regular folks, and he grew up in that sort of environment where he was never felt like a rock star.
But when you interviewed him, did you have to hide the broken glass and peanut butter? That's when he gets a little wild, right?
Well, and then, the thing is, you can have a frank conversation about him with that stuff. You realize what you're doing. You realize how dangerous it is. I mean, you talk to him like okay, this isn't just an act. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Why are you destroying yourself for people's benefit? And he goes, I think, he would give you like a thoughtful answer. He said, I had to embody the music. He said, I am so limited as a singer that I had to figure out a way to entertain the audience because that was first and foremost. He, came up in those blues clubs in Chicago. He spent a lot of time here and he watched those guys perform. And he said, like, it's a performance. And if you can't deliver on one thing, you've got to over deliver on something else. So maybe it was just, I think for him, it was kind of almost overcompensating for the fact that he felt totally inadequate, being up there. But it was an interesting answer. I've seen him like topple amplifiers. I said, "Are you aware that you could kill somebody?" He goes, "Yeah, I am." and it's just like, I want to go as far as I can without doing that, but he's very aware of the fact that he's doing some really unusual shit for a guy on a stage. You don't have to go that far, to entertain the crowd. I think he's the greatest live performer I've ever seen, though. I don't think there's anybody even a close second. Maybe David Yao, the Jesus Lizard.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Those are the two greatest, I think.
It's a good two.
Now, see, we're just going to do all tangents. We're never going to actually talk about the film. That was my favorite moment, really early on, seeing that early Jesus Lizard show. I think where they were throwing out the EP with the drum machine on it, right? So that was one of the earliest, full with the drummer shows. So it was pretty sparse at the Metro, and then a bunch of these people from the music scene in Champaign who are a little more rough than I was, like David Yao, jumped into the crowd and they separated, and he hit the floor like a wet fish. And then instead of picking him up, what these kids did was they held him down. They all like collectively like put their hands on him, and he was like a little bug stuck on the floor just trying to get up. It was an amazing moment. Yeah. He thought that was the funniest thing he'd ever seen because he was used to, jumping into the crowd.
I think, he just cracks himself up, and he's loaded too. So it's like, feels no pain. He said, I've done things to my body that I didn't feel until the next day because I was so loaded on stage. I was at a show where he set himself on fire. And I'm not kidding you. He like put lighter fluid on his jeans and took out a lighter and set fire to himself. And there's literally flames. I go, "What were you thinking?" It was, "Well, if you wear really tight jeans, it doesn't hurt."
Well, there's a gag we used to do at parties where we'd take a bowl of water and we'd put it on the table out in the middle of the room. And then I'd go in the bathroom and I'd spray my arm down with Lysol. And then I'd come out with a cigarette. And a friend of mine would go to light the cigarette and he'd light my arm on fire. And, it doesn't burn. It just burns your arm hair. And I'd just go, "Ah, ah." And everybody at the party would be like, "This guy's arm on fire." And I'd shove it in the bowl of water, after it started to get close to the skin. And then everybody would just freak out for like 10, 15 minutes after that.
You're certifiably nuts. I'm thinking that in my subconscious right now.
I haven't done it in 30 years. And look, we played with a lot of fire as kids. I'm very capable.
You can control fire. You're good with fire, right?
Yeah, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We're not in the same room, so it doesn't matter. Welcome to Lost and Found and Rewound, a show that is mostly about the past, rarely about the future, and never about the present. I'm Chris Lost.
I'm Found Jim.
And I'm Rick Rewound.
And we've been talking with our special guest today. Rick, do you want to introduce our guest since we've been engaging with him for a while now?
Yes. Our guest today is a longtime music journalist, critic, and author who just a few weeks ago celebrated the 800th episode of the radio show / podcast Sound Opinions, which he has co-hosted for over 20 years. In addition to books on Wilco, Mavis Staples, and the Staple Singers, and the digital music revolution, he has authored a book on coaching youth basketball, one of his true passions. He recently became the editorial director of the Coda Collection, a premium streaming service on Amazon Prime dedicated to music documentary and performance, which is why we asked him on the show. We love talking about movies, and we love talking about music. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Greg Kot.
Hello. Thanks, guys. Thanks for inviting me on your show.
This Coda Collection, that's what triggered in my mind asking you to come on the show, is because you just took on this role and music documentary. We do this show on VHS films that inspired us, but we always go off on tangents about music. And then when you had mentioned that you had this new gig, it was like music documentary, film. That's the kind of thing that would be great for us to talk about and have you on to talk about a music film. And so I reached out, asked you, and you said, yeah, sure. And so, Greg, what film have you chosen for us to discuss today?
I wanted to abide by your, available on VHS, or maybe only available on VHS roll, and that would be Ladies and Gentlemen, the Rolling Stones, which is a concert film that was made it was of a concert that occurred in 1972 when the Stones were touring right behind Exile on Main Street, and was released in theaters in 1974 for a brief run. Resurfaced as a VHS in Australia, I believe. For some reason, it was very limited in terms of how widely it could be available. The Stones apparently decided to distance themselves from it. And so I saw initially in the 80s via a bootleg of that Australian DVD, or I'm sorry, VHS. And then finally, it was issued on DVD in like 2010. You know, it's filtered out various places, but now Kodak Collection actually has the exclusive streaming rights to the video. You know, we've paid for the licensing, of course. It's just an extraordinary film. I had not seen it since the 80s, since that bootleg copy of it on a grainy screen, and seeing it kind of vividly, you know, in its original form, pretty powerful stuff. I think it's the best Stones concert film by a wide margin, and also a great representation of the band at its peak. This was kind of the run of great albums that they'd made right around that period when Mick Taylor joined the band, tail end of Beggar's Banquet, and then Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street. So they were rolling, hitting on all cylinders at that point. This was before the Stones became sort of a circus act, you know, the big spectacle, the giant props, the inflatable, you know, whatever, you know, on stage. They were just a band playing on stage, you know, and basically it's just I think it's a 16 song set, maybe 15 songs. They just rip right through it. I mean, it's just like boom, 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 one after another.
Yeah, and that's what really struck me is seeing how close together they are on stage, how it's just the band playing. They do have Bobby Keys there and you know, the horn section,
Right.
but it's still a band playing together as opposed to, yeah, like you said, the giant production. But even, you know, you watch a Stones live film from any time after this, right? And they're miles away from each other. They're hardly interacting, and this still feels like a band playing together.
That's what I love about it. It is a band playing together. There's no offstage backing tapes or anything like that. This is just the sound the band makes on stage, and it's, you know, remarkably rough and rude, and at the same time just energetic as hell. You know, they're just so into it. You can tell, and the audience is obviously into it, but it's really the band's performance. It just is hard to take your eyes off of, and you realize what a powerful thing they could be. And they've sort of turned it into this greatest hits jukebox over the years, and those are undeniably great songs, but they were still in a period here where they were making great music and they were focusing on their new material. You know, they weren't playing greatest hits. They were playing songs, deep cuts off their new albums. You know, that was the show. Fuck you if you don't like it, you know, because we love it. It's kind of like, we're proud of this record we just made and we're going to play all of it. And in the case of the Ladies and Gentlemen show, it's almost exclusively Exile tracks and Sticky Fingers tracks. They don't even play Satisfaction.
Yeah.
You know, which, like, if you go to a Stones show now and you don't get that, you feel like you're being ripped off. Back then they were like, oh, that song's 6 years old. We don't want to play that.
Exactly.
You know?
That's old stuff.
I'd argue that if you go to a Stones show now, regardless of what they play, you'd feel like you got ripped off. But that's just me. I'd never seen the Stones live until 2 years ago, just before the pandemic. I saw them in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of the show, I was like, oh, this is going to be a drag, because it was just kind of slow. And then as the evening picked up and the show got increasingly better, I kind of saw the glimmer or the shine of the Stones come through. And at the end, I was like, wow, this is pretty damn good. But it was super expensive and in a football stadium, so it wasn't very intimate.
The price is so exorbitant. I can't recommend anybody go see anything for that amount. I mean, you know, entertainment. If I'm paying over $50, I'm going, what is this, like the second coming on Easter weekend? I suppose that's an appropriate reference. It is one of those things where they've become this rich person's act, and they are performing for those rich people so that they can sustain the machine that has become the Rolling Stones. Although I have to say that last tour you're referencing, I saw them. They were at Soldier Field, and I was not going into that with the idea that it was going to blow my doors off. But Jagger had just taken a month off or whatever. He had that ailment, that heart
issue, yeah.
And I think it might have been his first show since then. And he came out like with purpose. There was a moment where Keith was looking at him. I had a pretty good seat on the side, and Keith was just sort of looking at him and just kind of broke out in this huge smile because Jagger was just so invested in what he was singing. I mean, it was not like a phoned in performance at all. I was kind of like, wow, that was a good show. These guys were really into what they were doing. Charlie Watts was back there smiling like they were really glad to be on stage together. That's all I can ask for a band. The Stones, when they're good, they can play an old song and put some new ripples in it. You know, they have this kind of thing where they're kind of loose about it. It's not like this really tightly structured thing. And when they're doing that, like Keith is looking at Charlie and Charlie's looking at Keith and Ronnie's looking over at Keith, and they're kind of like doing this kind of weaving thing where everything's just sort of melting together and it's kind of haphazard. And there's a few bum notes, but you don't care because they don't care. It's a kind of a cool thing. There's very few bands that play like that. So I kind of take it for what it is. You know, it's kind of this jazz blues influence as opposed to straight up spectacle rock show. I wish they would vary the set list more. That's just my biggest thing is I'd love to hear more deep cuts. They have such a great catalog, and I feel like they play 10 or 12 songs that are like they have to play. They feel like they have to play those every set, and that's when it gets kind of old for me. And you're right about the distance on the stage. It just feels very remote. But when they get in a little circle and they play together, it's like when Neil Young and Crazy Horse sort of huddle around that drum riser. You know, it's that same, oh yeah, it's a real band.
I love that about Ladies and Gentlemen. It felt like they were the Blue Angels at times. Like they would sort of get into this diamond formation and they just sort of really be enjoying one another's company. And I was like, I wonder how often that happens now. I mean, maybe it still does. Maybe I'm being a little cynical about it, but I'd never seen any Stones live film. So I watched Ladies and Gentlemen. I watched Let's Spend the Night Together, and I watched Gimme Shelter this week. Just to kind of get some perspective on, 3 different performances. While they were all good and had their merits, Ladies and Gentlemen it was intimate. It was playing all those songs that they had just recorded. So you wonder as an audience member, were they disappointed or were they picking up on the fact that, no, this is some of the best Stones songs ever written and you're getting a very rare peek into that, seeing them play this stuff a way you'll never see them play it again, because then they're going to have to start doing the greatest hits tours at some point. But yeah, it was awesome.
Well, you have to realize that they were a contemporary act when they were playing, right? So that's I think the big difference, right? Is that not that the Stones aren't still making new music and everything like that, but that the weight of the past gets overwhelming at some point. But if you're in the audience and it's a band that's been put out a record every year for the past 3 or 4 years, the biggest band in the world at the time, or the greatest rock and roll band in the world at the time, I think you have to realize that, oh no, it's not this kind of thing where it's like, oh, they didn't play Satisfaction. All that dynamic didn't exist until a few years later, right? And so
Right.
So for the audience, I bet it's amazing because it's like, this is the Rolling Stones. This is a contemporary thing. And so it's really hard. Like when I think of the Rolling Stones as a contemporary act, it would be when Some Girls came out, right? That's when that was new music, right? The Some Girl stuff. Everything else before then is old music, was old music to me, right? It was oldies. Being able to experience a band in their prime when they're still a contemporary band, I guess you would call it, as opposed to a nostalgia act. And I guess it's unfair to call the Rolling Stones. I feel bad saying that, but that is what they are, right? It's just what happens.
I mean, I think they would even have to own up to that. I mean, that's what they are. I always ask them about it. Richard's always said, we got to play the songs that Jagger wants to sing. It really comes down to that. Mm-hmm. He's got to feel, and then he feels like if he doesn't give them the hits, he says the worst thing that can happen is it's a dead audience. They don't respond to the deep cuts. They respond to Start Me Up. It's like if I hear that song one more time, it's like I just want to go die in a corner somewhere. But. I'm thinking, I'm looking at this set list here. They do this version of Sweet Virginia. I haven't heard them do that song in decades. And it just sounds so great. I mean, it's just like, man, they're, Keith and Mick are facing off on that microphone and they're singing Keith singing harmonies with Mick, that doesn't happen anymore either because they got the big backing chorus, But those two guys, their voices, Keith looks like he just got in a fight and walked in off the street and just started singing. He barely knows what the song is. Oh, I heard it one time. I'll chime in on the chorus the next time through. There's something really cool about that. That's sort of off the cuff, ragged guys on the porch just singing songs together. I love that vibe.
I like Happy too. Yeah. Well, I like Sweet Virginia too. That was great. But yeah, and then with him, how many times has he sung that song? Or that even on the records, it's like I always wished there were more songs, more Keith songs that he actually sang. And are there only two? I mean, how many? I don't know that many Rolling Stone. I don't know their catalog well enough, but there are not many that he sang, right?
He sings a different one in Let's Spend the Night Together. It's not Happy, but it's great too. It's great.
That's what I loved about this version of Happy, because from what I remember, all the other concert films, or just the concerts I've seen, is like that's when Keith sings and then Mick goes off and rests or, changes outfits. Whereas in this performance, they're singing together. And that's where all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow, that's infinitely better. All respect to Keith Richards and everything like that, but there's something super powerful when the two of them are singing together, like you were saying with Sweet Virginia, where it's just like, okay, this is really magical, because you also feel a little bit of tension where it's just kind of like, Mick, you don't have to, you can back off a little bit, right? But it feels like he's still like, I still got to be here, but it does push the song over the top.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. I asked Keith once, how do they decide who's singing the song? And he says, usually it's like, we'll be doing the song and it's time for the vocal to come in, and Mick just sits there. And that's his sign, like, he doesn't want to sing this one. So I guess I got to do it. And I agree with that to an extent. It's kind of like, okay, I'm not into this one, but you can take it, and it's like, I miss that aspect of it, and that sort of intimacy. We were talking about the set list too, and you mentioned Some Girls. That was the first time I'd seen the band, 78 at Soldier Field. I was in college. We literally had the last seats in the house. So like Keith and Mick were like the size of ants, but we were in the farthest point you could be away from the stage. Get this, opening acts, Journey, Steve Perry, first run with the band. The Lights Go Down in the City, or whatever that song was. They were starting to get some chart action, but they had Southside Johnny and the Asbury Jukes as the opening band, then Journey, then Peter Tosh.
Wow.
And I think Mick actually came out and sang with him, Don't Walk and Don't Look Back, or something like that. They had like a single out. So it was a pretty cool day. But anyway, their set list consists of 9 of the 10 songs on Some Girls.
Wow.
So they basically played the entire album, and it had been out less than a month.
Wow.
And I bought it like right away. I was a big Stones freak, and me and my friends, we were like all over this record, and we played it to death. So we knew that record inside and out. We loved the record. We were hoping they'd play some cuts. They ended up playing just about the whole thing. And people are leaving the stadium, and they're going, that sucked. That sucked. Where was, they were already pining for, like, why weren't there more hits from the 60s or something like that? And they played some of those songs. The whole set list was not those songs. It was like all this new stuff that they were laying on. Then I interviewed Jagger once, like years later, and I said, why don't you play your new stuff anymore? And he gave me the answer about, I want the audience to be responding. I said, you used to play your new albums front to back. He goes, really? And then I'm like, yeah, I saw you guys play basically the entire Some Girls album. And he goes, no, we never did that. and then there's like a book. There's a really good book that has every Stones concert date and every set list from those shows. And I looked it up just to think, was I high? I was high, but I know what I saw.
Yeah.
Well, lo and behold, there it is. It's 9 of the 10 songs on Some Girls on that day in Chicago. And I looked at the set list for the rest of that tour. Half the set list was Some Girls. So you haven't seen that probably since that era.
Yeah, that's the turning point, right? Yeah, that was probably when, and that's why Mick, he's probably blocked it out. It's just like, it might have been a painful experience, because that's always, the most dangerous time for a band is playing the new songs. And then, if you're a stadium band, it's a hard choice to make. Either you go, okay, we're just not going to play the songs everyone wants to hear, or we're going to play what everyone wants to hear and continue flying around in our jets.
There was a Built to Spill tour that I saw before they got stripped back down to 3-piece, but he was playing with Caustic Resin, I think was the name of the band that he kind of commandeered. I went to, I think, 2 or 3 shows on that tour, because on that tour, they all knew all the songs, and every set list was different. So if you liked Built to Spill and were in on the entire catalog, it was an incredible experience, because every show was different, tons of deep cuts. You wouldn't have guessed, what they were playing. And they're not playing any of the hits, I guess, the most popular songs off the records, because they didn't really have radio hits. And I remember thinking, now I know why people follow bands around, because if bands operate in this mode, I travel for a living, and I tried to travel to as many cities as I could to try and catch the next show, because I just knew it wouldn't be the same show. But I think that that's a very esoteric, or I don't know how to describe it, but it's a very sort of, you're catering to a much smaller demographic when you do that, because it's just fanboys who know all your stuff and just want to see you play live.
I mean, that's a great example, but I mean, look at the Grateful Dead. They played stadiums and they never played the same show twice either. I mean, it was a completely different set every night. Whatever you think of the band, I admire that a lot. They kind of set a template for a number of bands today that are following it. Whatever you think of Pearl Jam, they don't play the same set twice. It's pretty much a different show every night. So there's bands like that, and their fans love them for that reason. I followed Springsteen around in '78 when I had the ability to do that because I couldn't get a job. So I was just following bands around. And Springsteen played a bunch of small arenas in the Midwest, and after Darkness on the Edge of Town came out, and that was one of the best tours I'd ever seen by any band. I mean, I'm not a huge Springsteen fan anymore, but I was back then. And those tours were amazing. There was truly an element of improvisation every night. Like, it was a lot of stuff was being made up as it went along. And I also was at a show in '75 that he did at the Riverside in Milwaukee, my freshman year in college. There was a bomb scare. So they went across the street to a hotel. We all went there. The band got drunk at the bar. And they finally let us back in at midnight after like a 4-hour delay. So everybody's lit. And later I found out Springsteen can't hold his liquor. So they play a 4-hour show, and they literally called out the set list throughout the whole show. It was just totally. He starts like, let's play Wilson Pickett, midnight hour, start the show. It's like, and it went from there. It was completely like we're in a bar and it's just us and our buddies playing together, and it's like, it was so cool. But that sort of element of spontaneity, I think it takes effort to do that every night. And when you're sort of building your show around a spectacle as opposed to a musical event, it makes that sort of off the cuff thing almost impossible.
Kansas City. Food-wise, a city famous for its barbecue. But that's about to change. My name is W. Dave Keith, host of the podcast Taco the Town, and I believe that Kansas City is one of the most underrated, underappreciated, up-and-coming taco towns in the USA. On Taco the Town, we will shine a light on all the amazing tacos Kansas City has to offer. Kansas City is a great taco town filled with a variety of untapped taco stylings and flavors. And on the Taco the Town podcast, we won't stop until we've tasted every taco in the town. No taco table will go unturned. Each episode, we review a new taco joint with a special guest. We share taco memories, discuss taco topics, and put tacos to the test. We check the latest stories in taco news, and no taco is off the table on Taco the Town. If you love tacos, like I do, you're gonna love Taco the Town. Available on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and Google Play. That's Taco the Town.
Like, literally, Pink Floyd would have like an X marked on the stage at a certain time in the show where David Gilmour had to stand on that spot and do this exact same thing for 3 minutes, because everything, the visuals, the lights, was all synced up for that precise moment. And every moment would be choreographed like that. What is that? That's not a rock show anymore. It's kind of like something.
It's theater, right?
Yes,
so
it's Cats or something. It's a Rob,
Yeah.
I don't dislike this spectacle, though. I saw Roger Waters a couple of years ago, and I kind of loved it. The whole inflatable flying things and the screens. And I actually saw David Gilmour, I think, the same year at the Hollywood Bowl. And it was very rehearsed, too. It's got its place, but you're right, Rick. It's theater. You're not going to see a band and enjoy the energy of a live band. You're going to see a fantastic spectacle. It's almost like you're just listening to the record with a light show, which isn't why I go to live performances. I actually want to see what you're describing, Greg, which is the band interacting with one another, which is what this film was. I thought was that, you're really seeing them play together and play stuff that they're proud of together.
They include the like Mistake, what is it?
Tumbling Dice, right? Like,
or Jumpin' Jack Flash or something.
There are a couple mistakes.
They blow the ending.
Yeah,
it's great that they include
in this
that.
film.
But it's like Keith storms back, and I don't know if he's mad at Charlie or saying it was my fault because it's like he keeps playing and almost everybody else stops but it's great that they include it in the film too. It's like
there are definitely a few moments where a song starts and then they're out of sync, and you see that moment where the band there's tuning, all that stuff that gets cut out of concert films now, and that's part of what I liked about the film is it was in a weird way. So I don't think you can talk about this film without talking about, let's call it CS Blues, right? Which is kind of the alter ego of this film, right? From the same tour, I'm assuming, the Robert Frank film, right? And but in a way, it's kind of the Ladies and Gentlemen is kind of a cinema verite exercise also, in that you do get all of those moments of in between, you get the mistakes, even though I guess there's a song that was left out because it was so badly out of tune. I do feel like I was at a concert, and all of the weird down moments or the mistakes and everything like that, and a little bit of confusion, all that stuff is in there. That's what I enjoyed about it, is because I realized also, like watching, I think the last live Stones thing I watched was the Martin Scorsese one, which I kind of enjoyed and had one of those moments. I remember, I think I had my headphones on and I was watching, and I almost felt like I was in the band, and then there was a moment where I thought I saw like Mick look at Keith and Ronnie, and like it was like the ship was starting to tip over, it was like they're about to fall off, and then all of a sudden it came back. But it was like I could feel that moment, like when you're in a band where it's just like, oh, we're about to fall off, we're losing the thread, guys, that kind of feeling. And I had that moment, which was great, but really most of the time you feel that kind of clean performance, and they've edited out all the extra stuff, unless they're intentionally putting it in to make you think that, this is, it's like a real concert, but it feels very, structured and performed, as opposed to this film, which felt really realistic.
Yeah, no doubt. It's interesting what you're saying about the Robert Frank movie, that was another one that they quashed. That was the initial attempt at filming that tour, and they were never going to let that come out, although it's all over YouTube. I guess you can watch it just about any time you want. I think it's somewhat overstated about how debauched it is, but most bands would never allow a camera to depict that sort of thing. But back then, that was the last of that thing where you just got this kind of very real, visceral window into that world. I'm thinking of like the Dylan movie, Don't Look Back.
Exactly.
I can't even imagine a rock star today allowing, at the height of his like fame, allowing that sort of depiction, because Dylan can come off like a jerk in that movie.
I watched that film recently for the first time, and it was not a flattering depiction of Bob Dylan, and I was pretty surprised.
Yeah, I think it's a dangerous film, because I think young musicians can watch that film and get a really bad impression on how you're supposed to behave. I sound like a grandmother, but it's like, wow, this is like a template. Like, if you're Bob Dylan in 1965, this is fine, but if you're Joe Schmo in Bloomington Normal 2021, this is not a template. That's what I love about the film, though, too, is that it's like, wow, this is almost like a dangerous person. Right? Like, not physically dangerous, like societally and culturally dangerous, right? You can feel that, and he's actually, has some power, and also can mess with people and has the freedom to do so, but also you enjoy it. It's like, it's kind of like Keith Richards corrupting you with a cigarette. I also feel that way when I watch Don't Look Back. It's like, wow, this is really attractive, like, to be that person. It would be really great to be able to be that person.
Well, so Greg, we told you we were having some dark conversations before, and I'm not going to share any specifics, but we were basically talking about how music and being in bands and stuff sort of can lead to bad behavior or exercising bad behavior. What is your opinion of that? I mean, obviously the world is changing, and I'm sure the tolerance for that type of behavior, but for decades, let's say from the 60s forward, debauchery, trashing hotel rooms, dating 13-year-old girls, treating people like trash, being a narcissist, all of this stuff was a part of the persona. And then, there were all the people who didn't make it to the level to where that's tolerated. And our conversation was about those folks who are really struggling with life now, because they just couldn't get out of that mindset of trying to be one of these damaged and damaging musicians. But any take on your observations of how that formed and whether it'll continue?
The sex, drugs, rock and roll thing, that was perpetuated for forever. When I was young, that was supposed to be the way you were supposed to be. It was kind of like, this is the image that we have made for these people. And, there was transgression is a really appealing concept to a 15-year-old. It's like, wow, he's breaking all the rules and getting away with it. That's exciting. But the older you get, the more you realize how horrible, the self-destructive behavior is. I had a few conversations with Buzz of the Melvins, over the years, and he's just brutal about even Cobain. He just thinks, what a bunch of idiots. These people with the heroin habits and just excessive lifestyles. I mean, these great bands that destroyed the great thing they had going because they couldn't handle whatever, and they took drugs or they abused people or they became assholes. Sometimes all of the above. It's an indulgent industry that the money machine keeps rolling as long as you keep bringing in the money. With Dylan, I think you saw the start of the pressure cooker. Like, he was really feeling besieged, and that perhaps didn't come across as clearly as it might have been in his defense in that movie, because he's constantly jousting with everybody in his life, and you get a sense of the fact that he was feeling like surrounded on all sides. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think there's an accounting coming. I mean, the Me Too stuff it's caused me to reassess a lot of things too. I just the way we took for granted a lot of stuff, and that whole art versus artist debate, I'm pretty much haunted by that for every year I've ever been an adult. It's like, that is really like, okay, do I really support Miles Davis, David Bowie? They did these not so nice things. Am I supposed to just overlook that in listening to their music? Some artists I've drawn the line at, I can't stomach it anymore. I just can't bother to listen to their music anymore. And because of their behavior, I think there's more of an accounting going on than ever. And I would say a lot of people are having that, where stuff that used to be sort of brushed away now doesn't get brushed away as much, which I think is probably healthy. I've met enough people in music who are decent people that you realize you don't have to be an asshole to make great music, great art. And some people, sometimes that goes hand in hand with their art. They're this kind of like weirdly driven individual that if they hadn't had music, what would they have become? It's almost that dire. Like, if the music literally saved this person's life. Otherwise, they would have been a disaster. So yeah, I think you have to take it on a case by case basis. But I appreciate the fact that people are thinking about it more than ever. It seems that way anyway.
That leads to my big question, my bombshell question here, which is, like, when this movie started out and Brown Sugar started playing, and honestly, Sticky Fingers is one of my favorite records. I listened to it forever. Oddly enough, I'm not a lyrics person. Like, blah, 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 and I'm listening to the melody, I'm listening to the instruments. At some point, I started listening to lyrics, and I'm like, wow, okay. And so my big question was, is there a reckoning for the Rolling Stones? Is there going to be a cancel point, for them? Because there is a lot of problematic stuff, not just behavioral, but lyrical and, subject matter. And I'm just wondering, is that something that's going to happen? Is it going to happen the next time they go on tour? Or is it something that we forgive them for some reason and they're still getting a pass? And I'm curious about everybody's thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, Brown Sugar aside, I mean, that's the lyric. And he hasn't been singing that particular line anymore. I think he has altered that. Jagger, I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So they're aware of like this. Yeah, this is kind of. They were trying to be typical Stones, like let's push the button. Let's push your buttons and let's see how far we can take this. I loved Stray Cat Blues until I figured out what it was about, and it was like, oh, that's kind of creepy. Not kinda, it is creepy, and it's like, but at the same time, it's kind of a cool song. I feel the same way about some of Ice Cube's music. It's like I really like that America's Most Wanted record, but there's stuff on that album that I have real problems with. It's interesting how the Stones have sort of negotiated that. The 70s, it was a horrible decade for everybody. Talks about the rise of feminism. Music industry wasn't promoting the rise of feminism at all. I remember the Black and Blue record came out and I was still just a kid, but then I saw the advertising for it. And I don't know if you guys are probably too young to remember any of this, but there used to be like ads taken out promoting that record of a woman tied up, her legs splayed, and black and blue bruises all over her body.
Oh, wow.
And I'm just like, that's an ad campaign for a Rolling Stones record. Exactly. Somebody at a record company approved that ad and said, yeah, let's go with this. And then, Richards with that line, when they had the Some Girls record, why did you call it Some Girls, Keith? And Keith goes, because we couldn't remember their effing names.
Yeah.
I mean, that was his response to an interview question. It's like,
And this is the thing is I remember when Some Girls came out being in Chicago, like Jesse Jackson, was very public and saying, this is inappropriate. There's inappropriate stuff on this record. We need to call them out. And that was 1978. Yeah, it's just something we're going to be battling with. My theory is that we understand that the Rolling Stones are, I don't know, we know that they don't mean it maybe, or that they're singing this because they want to push the edge, but does that mean they endorse it? I don't know. It's really interesting to me because it's like I feel like there's ample opportunities for people to get up in arms. Like the Black and Blue advertising campaign, I don't remember it, but I remember seeing somebody writing about it, right? And so whether or not that reckoning's coming for them or they've just become so institutionalized where it's just kind of like this giant ocean liner and it's very hard to dent it in any way.
There are several generations of who've gotten a pass because it was okay back in that day. Nobody really blinked an eye. It wasn't really a big issue. You think about the band like the Stones, they had songs like Stupid Girl and Under My Thumb. I mean, they were writing misogynistic songs almost from day one, as soon as Keith and Mick started writing together. I think a lot of it comes from a place of anger and unfiltered anger, and I think it's genuine in some ways. I think they were also listening to a lot of blues songs where there was a lot of nastiness going on. I mean, Good Morning Little Schoolgirl, that's actually a playful blues song, but it's playful about some really creepy stuff. And there's a lot of blues songs about killing your woman because she done you wrong or because I'm mad at her. It's like they're coming out of that tradition, and that has gone on for decades before the Stones came along. And that doesn't excuse it. I'm just saying that for a long time, a lot of this stuff used to get a pass because it was expressing a genuine human emotion.
And, I think if we go back to talking about the Stones or any band before they were a franchise, right? When I got into music, therapy was not common, and I needed a lot of therapy, to be honest, if I'm being honest about myself back in that day. I was the guy at the party who lit his hand on fire. The truth of the matter is that the primal catharsis of being able to write and say anything you wanted and just say, hey, it's a song, it's fiction. All those songs have all those awful things in them. So do Martin Scorsese films. Films that come out today have people using the N-word. Well, that's a villain, so that person can say that. There's language that people get away with in film and TV. And, I guess we go back to, well, is it the voice of the person singing the song that is saying those words, or is it that person playing a character? And is this fictional?
Poetry or
right.
It's not necessary.
Yeah, it goes back to the Bob Dylan thing, right? It's like you've decided who I am based on this voice in this song, but that's not necessarily who I am. And
right.
Yeah, that whole idea is that disconnect between the artist and the art, but then also is the artist speaking through their voice. And then, with rock and roll or music that you're really emotionally invested in, a lot of times you feel like that person is communicating not only what you're feeling, but what they're feeling, right? That you're making that connection and finding out that person is not. We talked about this earlier, Chris, before you were on, Greg, is that idea of the voice of the monster. And so that was really popular in kind of like punk rock and post-punk, in the 80s and 90s, speaking in this voice of a monster, but you were kind of doing a commentary on that, right? You had to understand, and in the community, you understood that when this person was talking in that voice and saying these awful things, they were bringing a light, a spotlight on these issues that weren't being talked about in the mainstream. But you listen to those songs now and you just go, this is somebody talking about a child molester. Why is that appropriate? And it's because people didn't talk about that. And this is how you talked about it. And it was our alternative sort of news source and reality check where it's like, there's a lot of awful things going on in the world and no one's talking about it. And so all of that gets mixed up where these artists, are they that person or are they this other person? Are they performing? Are they speaking in the voice of the monster? And then it all gets mixed up. And then on top of it, if they get famous, they might turn into that person, which they weren't before, and it's
a good point. And I think a lot of it is like a song like Stray Cat Blues. I think it's an artfully constructed song. The character is believable and scary. And again, is that Mick Jagger or is that a character? Is that, there are people like that. I had a lot of conversations with Steve Albini about this, about the Big Black songs. It's like, what the hell, man? And he goes, and he basically talked about that whole idea. There's a lot of people want to sweep this stuff under the rug. It's out there. People think like this. This is a way of kind of addressing the fact that evil exists in our world. Sometimes the best way to address it is to put the light on it. Slayer songs too. I think Slayer gets a lot of shit for lyrics that actually tried to address some really serious issues in a way that was frightening, but also there was an intelligence behind it as well. So yeah, I mean, ditto for rap songs. So it's all the gangster rap stuff. The LA riots, if people had listened to gangster rap records, the LA riots might not have happened because people are going like, there's a problem in the inner city in the way that young black men are being treated by police. It's just, that was the only way I knew about that shit at all, because you didn't get that. It's like Chuck D was right, that black CNN. It's like CNN wasn't showing that stuff, No network news program was depicting the struggles of the black community, except for those gangster rap records.
Instead of thinking of the music as a symptom of what's wrong, you should think of it as evidence or revealing. It's not the cause of the problem. It's actually revealing and exposing it and speaking the truth. And people always get it backwards. It's like, I'm hearing something that offends me, and the initial instinct is I don't want to hear that. But the reason why it's offending you, a lot of times, sometimes people just offend to offend, right? Make music to offend, but in the cases you're talking about, they're actually saying, no, this is what's really happening. And the reason why you're reacting that way is because you don't want to acknowledge it. That's just been a long-running frustration now in the past few years, just referencing, the riots in LA, right? And that was 30 years ago. And it's like being around long enough to just realize nothing's really changed that much. It's like, I thought we were doing so good, and then it's just realizing it's something that comes with age, I guess, where it's just like, okay, this seems all too familiar. And maybe we need to be talking more, and hopefully we will. We should end on a lighter note. How can we...
I've got a shout out to Ampeg V4 amps.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to use one for a tour or two early on in our career, and that's what I remember from this. Well, everybody seemed to be using them on the whole back line of the band, like bass and both guitarists are using Ampeg V4s, and that's what I remember about. I hadn't seen this before, actually, till this week, but I'd seen Gimme Shelter, and that movie, what I always remember was, is it Madison Square, the show before Altamont, they show a little bit the Ampeg V4 amps, and I just remember, I remember from that movie, that was the best part. It was like that, it's like that show. I wish there was a whole concert of that. Well, there's an album, right? The album is that, but especially that movie, the sound was really raw. That show, just from my recollection of that film, is from Gimme Shelter, is that was even rawer than this film, but it's the same amps, and that it's just like a real band, and it sounded loud. The Gimme Shelter show, the Madison Square Garden, just sounded like too loud, but it was good. It was like, I bet it was really loud live. But this, and the way that, just how you were saying earlier on, how they're all together, close together. It was that too, the visual, but also the sound. It just sounded amazing.
And realizing how great Mick Taylor is. The thing about Mick Jagger is how dynamic he is, and I've been obsessed lately with Ron Wood, re-obsessing or whatever, and I love him, but I also feel like, and so I understand why Ron Wood, he moves around, right? So there's that dynamic there, and I like it, but watching Mick Taylor play, it was just like, wow, this definitely was the peak in terms of musicianship in the band. And my biggest frustration is that there's not a version of Can't You Hear Me Knockin', on from this tour. Or if there is, I need to find it, because that's... Yeah.
For some reason, they didn't play that one, but that's a great one. Yeah, Mick Taylor was, he almost looked like he never really quite belonged in that band, though, at the same time. You could just tell.
Yeah. He looked like he was in the almost like he should have been in Elvis's backup band with what he was wearing for the concert. He just had that. They kind of, they looked similar, the clothes, but his clothes, it was like the Vegas, whatever, that's the way it was for the Elvis movie. It was like he could have been in the backup band. It's his shirt. He looked good too, but it was just slightly more Elvis.
He must have felt like he got run over by a truck at a certain. It was just kind of like, how do you keep up with these guys?
I can't imagine.
I mean, I guess he developed a heroin habit too, and everything, and well with the Stones, like everybody did, even Charlie.
Yeah.
There's actually, I got to mention, in tandem with this, you're mentioning Coda Collection. We've got the Ladies and Gentlemen movie, but there's 2 other really cool little films that are part of that collection of Stone stuff from that era. And there's a rehearsal before that tour. That's pretty amazing. It's like they're doing like 6 songs. It's like 25, 30 minutes long. And it's just them in a room, like a little theater, practicing for the tour. So they're going through some songs, and they actually do like a couple of extended blues jams, and they do a couple of actual songs, but it's kind of like just them interacting. And it's fascinating to see because they're so they're relaxed, but they're really into it. Like Charlie's closing his eyes when he's playing, like he's feeling the vibe. They're like getting this groove going, and it's like very hypnotic and cool. And then there's another, they only did a handful of shows in England right after Sticky Fingers came out. So this is like a year before this. And one of the last ones was taped. It was like a club show. They did it like at the Marquee, I think, in London. And it's like a 30-minute show of them doing like fresh material. And it's another really intimate kind of look at the band during this period of time. And it's pretty cool to see that stuff. I mean, they really were a functioning unit. They played together. They got better together. They worked up songs together. They were just like, it was a glorious period of time. Despite all the decadence, their music was just at such a high level at that point that it's almost like anything you can get your hands on from that era is like worth checking out.
Do you know the names of those things, Greg, or how would we search to find them? Just go to the Coda channel and...
I've got some stuff here because I'm writing about it for the Coda collection. The Rolling Stones Rialto Theater 1972 rehearsals. That's the one that I referenced just right before the Ladies and Gentlemen tour. So they do like Hip Shake, which I don't think they did on that tour. That was from Exile. And then they do Love and Cup, which I don't think they did either. So those are like 2 tracks that they never actually played on that tour that are from Exile, plus some jammy stuff, which is, there's a couple of long takes on Tumble and Dice too, which is kind of cool. And then there's the Rolling Stones from the Marquee, which was from late 71. That was right before the exile period begins. They basically left England after that, didn't play England for a number of years for tax purposes. So that's why they ended up decamping to, Melcote in France for the exile recording. That's a pretty cool set list too. And that's got Live With Me as an opener, Dead Flowers with Mick and Keith on the mic together. That's cool. I Got the Blues, another raggedy kind of ballad you don't hear live much. They do a Chuck Berry cover, of course, Let It Rock. Midnight Rambler, Satisfaction, Bitch, Brown Sugar. That's a set list for that. It's cool because it's, again, very tight stage. Just those guys together up there.
Yeah, when I saw them in Jersey, I know they played Monkey Man, which was pretty exciting because I love that song. And then I think they played Dead Flowers.
The one thing that amazed me, just the last little thing, is that, I looked up the dates for these shows. And so they played 2 shows over 2 days in Texas that this was filmed. And so they were doing, like he mentions, like a Sunday afternoon show, Why Aren't You All in Church? And that's just the idea that they played 4 shows in 2 days, which is astounding to me to realize that they were able to pull that off.
Yeah.
And then Stevie Wonder not showing up. Something must have happened with Stevie Wonder. So that's the one thing about the Robert Frank film is the footage in that film of them with Stevie Wonder sort of jamming on stage is probably the best live performance I've seen with them. That's the one where it's like with the full band, the horns and everything like that. And Stevie's there, and that's amazing. And so that's one thing that I would love to see more is like if there was any crossover. Also just realizing the Rolling Stones were great right then, but like seeing footage of Stevie Wonder's band, I think on Sesame Street during that time is astounding. It's like realizing the level of performance that was going on in that era with some of these bands, and then to have a show that's Stevie Wonder and his band and then the Rolling Stones would have been overwhelming.
The Ike and Tina Turner performance in Gimme Shelter was pretty awesome, and they're watching it, and I mixed comments like, it's good to have a girl around every once in a while, or something like this, some sort of offhanded comment. I'm like, man, she kind of blew away every Stones performance I'm seeing. Reminded me of The Who in Rock and Roll Circus, just blowing away the Stones. So I'd imagine Stevie probably did the same thing. Prince opened. Greg, did you get to see when Prince opened for the Stones?
I was so neck deep in punk at that point that I couldn't even think about seeing a big bloated rock band on a stage that size. It was like, Minor Threat or die.
Exactly. I think having an intense small club experience, I mean, that happened to me where it was just like, wow, I don't think I can watch a performance in a big arena ever again. It kind of ruined it. It's like once you have those intense, small club experiences, it's hard. Well, unless you have an intense small club experience that you don't enjoy, right? I could see plenty of people be, crammed into a tiny club, loud music, and go, I never want to do this again. But for me, it was overwhelming, and it was just like, oh my God, like there is no reason to be in a space with more than 100 people watching music, right?
Yeah.
I missed out on all that. That was the first concert I went to was like the Aragon Ballroom or something, like the Smiths, I think, and I never, it's a pretty big place, but I've to this day, I've never really been to a arena rock show. Even my mom has seen the Stones at like Alpine Valley, and I've never saw the Stones, but she was sort of the same thing. Well, it was like she had never been. This was probably 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe 25 years ago. She went with our neighbors and their kids, and it was like, I want to go too. I want to go to this big rock show and see the Stones, and she did.
If AC/DC ever goes back on tour, Jim, we have to go because I've seen them several times in the last 10 years and like still incredible. First show where I kind of where I gave up on ever going to a stadium show for a while was Flaming Lips 1988 Oh My God tour with the old drummer. And that actually was an odd mixture of spectacle and a band sort of doing, because they had like the tractor trailer truck lights on the top of their amps. The bass player sort of controlled the coconut bubble machine and all that stuff from this like little foot thing that he had rigged together. But then they were just a punk band playing, post-punk, acid rock. And I was just like, holy shit, I can touch the sky. And I'm watching something that is far more powerful than the Pink Floyd show I saw a year ago on, Momentary Lapse of Reason tour. I was like, I think I'm done,
That was right in the time where I'm just like, this doesn't sound anything at all like Black Flag. It's like not interesting. And it's like, I don't know. And not to be snobby, I was pretty snobby back then. Patti Smith and all that stuff. I love that shit. And it's like everything else sounded fake to me. And the stadium shows in particular, I thought were the height of, it was just bullshit. And, I reviewed hundreds of stadium shows as a critic for the Trib. I understand what they were trying to do and I respect what they were trying to do, but I can count that on one hand how many times I felt like a real rush at one of those shows. And like if I'd see like Iggy at the Riviera, let's say, or Jesus Lizard at Cubby Bear, which I said, I saw a bunch of times, Husker Du, Minutemen. I mean, those were the bands that were just like, God, these guys are amazing. Mm-hmm. I mean, the moment that I became a critic at the Trib was when I saw 11th Dream Day in 1988, and they were playing Batteries Not Included, which had like a 6-inch stage. And I was like a foot away from Baird Figgy while the guy was sweating up a storm and it was 100 degrees in that club or something like that. And they were playing basically the first album. I was just like, God, this is amazing. Totally blew my doors off. And then I walked up to Rick Rizzo after the show and I said, listen, I work for the Trib. I'd love to write an article about you guys. And he was kind of like, yeah, okay, man, whatever. And it's like, like I was just totally bullshitting him. And he gave me his number. I called him. I said, yeah, I really want to do an article on you guys. And that was my first published article in the Trib.
Oh, that's awesome.
I never looked back. But I mean, it was literally a club show. I felt like nobody knows about these guys. Why isn't anybody talking about them?
Watching them was amazing. I just remember, I can't remember what the 11-minute long song was, but like Rick tossing his guitar in the air and everything like that. And it's like I had seen like The Kids Are All Right or something, right? I'd seen people get, like kind of the simulation of intensity and like electricity at a live show, but to actually be there when things were getting unhinged and loud and overwhelming, and it being in a small space and you could feel everything and you could, make eye contact with the people on stage. It's just those moments are so incredible, and it's it's frustrating that not more people get to enjoy those moments or understand it,
or don't want to, or
don't
whatever.
Want to.
That they miss out on it. I think they think rock is meant to be at the United Center, and it's just that's just not,
Yeah, I feel for those artists, but I would love to them have gotten their due, more so than a lot of these people that continue to make millions and billions. But it is an oral history that we all share. Now I can tell stories of Jad Fair playing a guitar that was never plugged in the whole show and then jumping off the 6-inch stage and jumping around everybody's table because there was only 30 people in the place. And like, that's something that I wish Jad Fair had taken home $60,000 that night. But, the fact that I was there to see him treat that situation that way, and then, it makes me feel a little different when there's only 5 people at my show. It's like, well, Jad Fair, he dealt with it in such a positive way. Like, why wouldn't anybody go at it that direction? And I just love that I can have that story. I can tell that story, and some people will get it, some people won't. Like, but again, I wish that Jad had gotten a pile of gold for the magic that he shared with me that night.
Well, I think your attention and the fact that you're talking about it now is probably worth something to him. The people who are there aren't going to forget that show. It's not the same thing as a pile of gold, but I don't know. I think for artists, that's the reward, is that they were invested in something so deeply that I don't think the monetary reward was even a consideration. for why they do it. It was about, they have to do this. And if somebody wants to come and see it, that's awesome. But it's not the reason I'm doing it. It's like, I've got to express myself in this way. And, I felt the same way about writing. It's like, I may never have anybody ever read my stuff, but I got to do this. I feel like I need to write. And, if it brings you joy and happiness, then that's kind of like the main reason, right? Like a lot of these bands that are making a pile of gold every night, I wonder how much they enjoy what they're doing anymore. It's almost like I'm running this business and I'm sort of obligated to do this because a lot of people will be out of work if I don't do it. And more I hear bands talking about it in those terms. I go, God, that sounds kind of sad. It's like a real sad reason to keep doing something.
Exactly. This is my crazy sort of big picture thing, is like the Mick versus Keith narrative and that battle. And so I feel like part of the squashing of the Robert Frank movie and everything like that was the beginning of Mick's, sort of desire to kind of control the band. But it's always these two battling narratives, and you've got the kind of Keith danger narrative, and then you've got Mick who wants to use some of that, but he also wants to be this important person, right? I think, and respected. So
didn't he accept his knighthood, and Keith Richards told him to go fuck himself because of it? Or there's some, maybe it's not true, but you might know if it's true or not, Greg. That's what I heard. That
a little bit behind in my knighthoods there, Chris. I don't know. I'm not quite. Don't keep up with Sir Paul or Sir Elton or whoever they are, but.
As we wind down here, Greg, we ask 3 questions. The first question is, should this film be lost? And I guess I'll ask it in the context of, is it better served to be a bootleg that you got off of an Australian VHS tape and it's kind of your thing like My Jad Fair story, or should it be a streamable film available to everyone in the world?
Of course. The latter. I mean, I don't see why more people wouldn't want to see this or should see it, because it's just a wonder. People who are unconvinced about the Stones maybe ought to see this. They will be convinced. If they're not, then they probably will never like the Stones. But to me, it's like a great depiction of a great band at the peak of its powers. And, it's one of those must-owns, to my mind, of like, if you want to be well-versed in music of the last, 50, 60 years, I mean, the Stones are in that mix. And this is a great representation of who they were at their best.
Yeah, and you answered the second question, too, which is, should it be found? Meaning, would you recommend to other people to see it? Sounds like you would. And I'll add, I've never been that big of a Stones fan. I like one sort of cluster of albums a lot, and Exile is in the middle of that cluster. But one of the things I always had against them was they always looked inept live or boring live to me. And this film, ladies and gentlemen, even Gimme Shelter, they look terrible live. I don't know why. Just not getting into it, particularly compared to people like Ike and Tina Turner. But boy, ladies and gentlemen, I was like, okay, this is the band. This is the energy. This is why you would go see the Stones live, because they really just cook beginning to end, and you get all of that energy and collaboration and stuff in this film.
I couldn't agree more. And I think I'm looking at the set list here again. That ending rush, Bye Bye Johnny, Rip This Joint, Jumpin' Jack Flash, Street Fighting Man. Those are like, it's like boom, boom, boom. They're like punching you in the face over and over again, like with this just like really blast of energy. And it's pretty exciting. I think people, I'm curious, because I know there's people who will be unconvinced still. They're sloppy. The harmonies aren't really that good. I can't understand the words. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you could find fault with if you're kind of into a certain type of sound. If you were a Steely Dan fan in the 70s, you probably are going to hate the Stones. And I love both bands, to be honest. I think Steely Dan's great too.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I could understand why somebody coming from that sort of perspective, like, God, I love those 80s Brian Ferry records. It's like, God, they're going to think this just sounds like absolute shit. But I just kind of love the raggedness of it. It's just like, it's loose. You know exactly where they're coming from. If you got the background in them, sort of that jazz blues nexus. I love hearing Keith talk about the records that influenced them, like the stuff that they putting their ears up to the speaker to hear a Jimmy Reed in like 1953 or something like that, how those guitars interacted, of like a cheese sandwich melting. He said those guitars would melt together, and we just love that. How do they do that? And they were trying to get that sound. That's what it is. That's the magic. That sounds awful to somebody who's like That doesn't sound too clean and precise to me. That sounds like slop. But I love that. I love that sort of spontaneous meld of minds and fingers and tones. Two tones become a third with the guitars coming together. And then that swing, the way that rhythm guitar plays off the drums. Charlie is like just a magical drummer, man. He's just a one quick anecdote about Charlie.
Yeah.
This is like on one of their more recent tours. Like the impression is they don't really give a fuck anymore. It's like they're, it's going to be a big payday tonight, guys. Can't wait to get to the catering, afterward. And then, so they're in the middle of the encore and they're playing a long show. Easily enough, they could have just got to that last song and skipped out. And Charlie points to his drum tech and I'm pretty close and I'm seeing that he's got a crack in his crash cymbal. And he wants the guy to replace it before they play the next song, and they're rushing because they're finishing this next song and they're going to go right into the next one. So the guy scrambles up on stage, gets the freaking crash thing, and Charlie just kind of nods and then bam, he slams that thing right away. He wanted to give the fans the full on thing. He wasn't going to cheat anybody, including himself. And it was just kind of like this attention to detail that you think these guys don't care about anymore. But, he did care. That's what I kind of love about those guys, that they have that. I remember almost getting a little misty-eyed one time. They were clustered around this small stage. They usually have this second stage where it's just the four of them or five of them on a stage off to the side, right? The ancillary stage, the satellite stage. And they look so tiny. They look like these little guys. You could just put them in a thimble, put them in your pocket and walk away with them. And they were just these little, they're tiny. Their hips were this long, wide. It was just how does a human body fit into those pants? It's just, they were just these little English guys. And you meet them in person, they're not larger than life. They're little guys.
How do they stay little, Greg? Is it cocaine? I need to try and get myself smaller.
Everybody gains weight. They go in the opposite direction.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
The last question is, should it be rewound? And really, should we watch it over and over again, I guess? And I guess I'd ask you, do you watch this frequently, or did you just kind of pick it up when it was now available? You'd seen it on VHS way back in the day, or is this something you'll revisit time and time again?
Yeah, I'll rewatch it at some point. I saw it a bunch because I was writing about it. I'm going to have something on it on the website, the Coda Collection website, in a few weeks. But so I watched it a lot, and I kind of was able to draw some nuances out of it that I missed the first time. And I think it's well worth watching because you do see the band interacting on stage, which is, instructive. It was instructive to me. I learned some stuff about the band. You mentioned Tina Turner earlier. It's interesting. There was a couple of moves in there that Jagger's his body's moving just like Tina Turner. There was this way he sort of took his shoulders and kind of did this kind of, little jive step. Then I'm going, that's a Tina Turner move right there. There's no way that would have happened if you hadn't seen her in 1969,
Definitely a sponge. Just always on the lookout for a new move and adding it to his repertoire. Yeah.
I made that note about Midnight Rambler. So it looked like he was ripping off James Brown, the way he was sort of crawling around on the stage and doing sort of all these gyrations and stuff. And then I was like, and then Prince, who was a student of James Brown, Little Richard and stuff, all sort of did very similar things like that. That Midnight Rambler sequence compared to what Prince was doing on the 1999 tour, or even Darling Nikki and stuff like that. I was like, wow, that's really similar. So I don't know where they're both getting that influence from, if Prince is getting it from the Stones or they're both getting it from some other artist that they both studied. But I thought that was pretty fascinating.
James Brown was on that, the famous 64, I think, movie.
Tammy Show.
Yeah, and that was, they got to study James up close and personal. But they were in on all those things. They're Brian Jones and those guys were at the feet of Muddy Waters doing this TV appearance. And in fact, the Stones made it possible for actually it was Howlin' Wolf, I think. The reason Howlin' Wolf got on national television was because the Rolling Stones insisting that he appear on the same show that they were being asked to perform at. They were huddled at his feet the children around Santa Claus at Christmas, Whatever you think of those guys, they actually did really champion a lot of their heroes, the people that sort of influenced them. They never forgot them. They were constantly either having them open for them or recording their songs or talking about them in interviews, I found out about a lot of stuff that preceded the Stones because of the way the Stones talked about those artists. So
yeah, they're actually kind of the hipsters or the cool kids that actually somehow became massively successful, right? They really were devoted to the blues and were purists in a way. And yet somehow, like typically when you hear that, it's like similar to indie rock, right? It's like, oh no, I only like this type of music, and I don't want to consider the other stuff. And you're just like, this is good. That other stuff is crap and sophomoric. That kind of very judgmental, elitist view or whatever. And yet they came from that background, but somehow turned into one of the biggest acts of all time. So it's a really interesting thing, that doesn't. Well, I guess it must have been the area because you could say David Bowie was like that too. I'm trying to think.
Well, Kurt Cobain did it for Daniel Johnston and Greg Sage, and there were people who came out of the indie scene who then he did it for the Meat Puppets too, right? He probably made their career a lot more robust by bringing them on that Unplugged show. So there's examples of people doing it generation over generation. It's such a machine now. I don't know, you just don't see it that often.
The one thing that I can always count on in an interview with an artist is if you talk about who they like. They light up. That's like when they really open up to you. They love talking about their heroes. Lou Reed loved talking about doo-wop and soul, early soul music, and it's like that would break the ice with him all the time. And he would be very specific about the stuff he loved and the sounds and stuff that you could just tell these guys were fans before they picked up an instrument, and they're still fans. It's interesting you said about the purist thing with the blues, with the Stones. The biggest purist of them all was Brian Jones, and he was the guy who actually helped open up their sound in the 60s. He was the guy picking up the sitars and the marimbas and all these kind of oddball instruments and really adding some cool touches to those singles that they had. They were a really great singles band in the 60s once they got writing original stuff. Brian never wrote the songs, but he was a big part of the arrangement and how those songs sounded. And they were just great pop singles in large measure because the blues purists, decided to branch out and do something other than just a straight up blues thing.
Yeah, explore other obscure, genres or little, known genres and areas and instruments and everything like that. And so brought that in, to the band. So he was just continuing his role, right? And then unfortunately lost that role or got lost in that role.
Poor Brian.
Every great band sort of has that, or like Cliff Burton did that for Metallica, and then when he died, they sort of got routine. I don't know, maybe you guys don't like Metallica. I like the early stuff.
I think the first 3 Metallica records are really good. I actually heard them as kind of a punk rock band too, in some ways.
Yeah.
Those early records, They were nasty ass guys, man. They were not that they were bad, nasty people, but their sound was so intense. I thought they were great. They lost the plot, but then
Well, they lost Cliff.
That's what happens.
That was when I think you
Cliff.
lose that catalyst in the band.
They all seem to look up to him.
Yeah, I could talk to you for 2 more hours, but it's my wife's birthday, and she's going to kill me if I don't get to dinner tonight.
I'm probably running a little late myself, but it was fun. I really enjoyed that. So I appreciate you guys asking me to join your movie talk. And obviously we talked about a lot more than just movies, but
That's what we like. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This was great.
sure, guys, I appreciate it. Thanks.
We talked a lot about heroes, and we should say that you're a hero of ours. I mean, you were a person writing about classic rock, indie rock, and we're all from Chicago. We all grew up in Chicago. We all played in bands. Rick and I ran labels for years, and people like you who wrote about the stuff that you wrote about, which was everything, not just the stuff that was above ground, but the stuff that was underground too. That inspired us to continue to do what we did because people were listening, and it actually turned us on to the stuff that we love today. So you brought us a tremendous amount of joy and continue to. You recommended this film and sort of shared a whole new world of music and the Rolling Stones that I would have never have explored. So thank you for not just today, but for everything you've done. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and Greg, you wrote the first article about our band that, my parents cut out of the newspaper, right? Before then, it was, on a Xeroxed fanzine, So that's an amazing moment, where your parents all of a sudden go, oh, this might be a real thing, right? I don't know if we went that far at that point, but it was like, oh, okay, this is not just a weird little blip or something like that.
I feel you on that one because I was an editor before I became the critic. And I kept telling my grandmother that I worked at the Chicago Tribune, and she goes, "Your name's never in the paper." And I swear she didn't believe I worked there. And then when I had a byline, she goes, "Oh, you got that job you've been talking about for so long."
Exactly.
But thank you guys. I really appreciate it. It's very nice, very kind words. And but it means a lot coming from you guys. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Lost and Found and Rewound is fully funded by Lost and Found and Rewound Foundation funds. Lost and Found and Rewound does not use crowdfunding because our listeners have better things to do with their funding. There's no need to post reviews of Lost and Found and Rewound because our listeners have more valuable things to do with their time. In all sincerity, thank you for listening to the show. We truly appreciate it.
Lotus Pod.